Hello everyone, sorry for taking a long break since my last video. I got hit by what seemed like a long sickness period since April, but hopefully I'm getting better now. So before moving on to chapter 2, I just wanted to answer some of the questions I saw in the comment section for the past 33 or so lessons in one video. I wanted to use a 3D environment to explain all the little details you might have questions about concerning perspective drawing. But as always with the way I make videos, I just couldn't do a short video. So this video was supposed to be 5 minutes. Now it's almost an hour or so. These examples in this video are important to understand the perspective not as a 2D drawing but a 3D world. I want you to understand the scene beyond what you see on the picture plane or the canvas, so that you can understand why things look the way they look on the picture plane or your canvas. So I decided to add this lesson to fill in the gaps that some of you might have after watching the previous lesson. As I said, in my opinion, the best way to understand perspective drawing is seeing it in a 3D environment. Now I never planned to go this deep into perspective drawing, especially on the introduction part. And especially because my end goal was a bit different than copying things in a correct perspective. It was more toward understanding how things look in a correct perspective so we can build on that later while designing objects for concept art. But nonetheless, we can ship out all the things we talked about before in regard to perspective terms in a 3D software to see how things really look from all angles, not just on a 2D canvas. And as always, most of this information comes from different artists and especially Scott Robertson's books, How to Draw and How to Render, just in case you wanted to expand on your education on perspective further on. So let's go back to the first lesson of perspective, the important terms of perspective. Here we see it in a 3D environment. We have the observer or the viewer or the stationary point. We have the ground plane, the object above the ground, the picture plane or the canvas or the camera picture. This is the place that we record the real world on between us, the viewers, and the world in front of us. At the eye level directly perpendicular on the picture plane, we have the line of sight or the eye direction. When the line of sight is parallel to the ground, we get either 1 or 2 point perspective view. When we tilt our head up or down, the line of sight won't be parallel to the ground anymore, and we get a 3 or more point perspective. The picture plane will always be perpendicular on the line of sight no matter how you tilt your head, up or down, left or right. The distance of the picture plane from the object or the viewer can be at any distance and at any size. It will affect the size of your drawing or how close it is to the object, as we will see later. Next we have the cone of vision. The cone of vision depends on the lens of the camera or the eye of the viewer. It's where the focus of the viewer is directly at. For a human eye, 60 degrees is the field of direct vision. Although we can see up to 180 degrees, the focus is right in the front of us, in a cone of 60 degrees angle. In camera lenses, anything between 40 and 60 degrees would be considered acceptable distortion, according to Scott Robertson. We will see later how that would affect the distortion when we draw it in a 2D drawing. Here we see the horizon line, or the eye level. Now these two terms can be tricky sometimes. Eye level doesn't mean the level of your eyes while standing on the ground alone, because when you are flying above the ground, eye level is at your eye level up there, and that's where the horizon line would be. Also, the eye level is different than the eye direction, which we will see when we tilt our head up or down. We will see it in animation later on, but just keep that in mind for now. Finally, we see the vanishing points left and right of our picture plane. We will see later from the top view how they follow the lines of the object all the way to the stationary point. But for now, these are the terms of perspective in 3D. Let's now see it from all sides. The blue line we see on the ground is the projection of the picture plane on the ground. It will become important later on when we draw the image we see on the picture plane using the real world outside of it. We can also see here from the top view how we got the vanishing point by drawing parallel lines to the object all the way to the horizon line at the picture plane. And where the two meet is where we get the vanishing points. So the picture plane is a 2D snapshot of the real 3D world in front of it, as we can see it here. In this animation we see the effect of moving closer or further away from the object on the picture plane or what we see on the canvas. Here we are moving the viewer or the stationary point and the picture plane toward the object, and you can see the front view and the top view on the picture plane as we move forward and backward. As we move forward, almost on top of the box, we start to see only part of the box on our picture plane, since our picture plane is a bit higher than the box, so parts of it start to disappear. And as we go back, the box gets smaller and smaller as we walk away from the object. Very straightforward. Before I talk about the focal length, let's see this chart. This is the different focal length of a camera and a human eye in relation to the cone of vision. So we see on the left the human eye can see different things at different focal lengths. We can see as wide as slightly above 180 degrees in front of us, but the optimal focus area is at 60 degrees. That's why Scott Robertson suggests to always use 60 degrees angle for the 2-point perspective to get the optimal distortion level that won't be too little or too much. When we check the camera focal length, every camera will have a slightly different angle, but in general at 60 to 40 degrees cone of vision, we get the normal angle length at 35mm focal length. The larger the cone of vision gets, the shorter the focal length will be and the wider the angle of the vision will get, and vice versa. We will see an example on this next to understand it a bit more. As you can see in this example, this is the cone of vision going from 30 degrees to 60 degrees and then to 90 degrees. The focal length changes with the angle of the cone of vision. As we saw in the chart before, the shorter the focal length is, the bigger the angle of the vision will be. So at a 30 degrees cone of vision, we have an 85mm focal length, and what we call a telephoto lens or a zoomed in perspective. At 60 degrees cone of vision, you get the 35mm focal length and the normal zoom or distortion, or a normal lens. At 90 degrees cone of vision, you get the 20mm focal length or a wide angle lens and a zoomed out perspective. As you see in the camera view, this is the 30 degrees cone of vision, this is the 60 degrees cone of vision, and this is the 90 degrees. The smaller the cone of vision angle is, the longer the focal length will be, and vice versa. Finally, we see here some examples on different focal length and how we see the perspective in every different one of them. As we said, the bigger the cone of vision is, the shorter the focal length will be, and the wider the angle when you see the environment in front of us. From 80mm or 100 degrees cone of vision all the way to 300mm focal length or 8 degrees cone of vision, or more or less. Now why would we care about this as artists? It will be important for us later when we turn this into a 2D perspective. Just hold on this information for now. Let's continue with seeing how the perspective changes when we change one or more factor of the perspective elements. Now before we saw how the eye level and the eye directions were on the same height. Now let's see what happens when we tilt our head up and down. We saw this example before in the horizon line lesson, and how when we tilt our head up and down, we don't change the perspective of the objects in the scene, just where we are looking at. Here is the clearer example. We said before that the picture plane is always perpendicular on the line of sight. So when we start tilting our head up and down, the picture plane will tilt with us, keeping that 90 degrees angle with the line of sight, and no longer staying parallel to the ground plane. If we look in the camera view, we see that the horizon line looks like it's moving up and down, but it isn't actually moving in reality. It's the picture plane that is moving up and down. That's why we still can't see the top of the blue box or the red cylinder, no matter how high up we look. And when we look down, we still can't see the bottom of the green box no matter how low we look. That is because the horizon line is still at the eye level of the viewer, and that doesn't change when we only tilt our head. Another thing to notice is how the perspective changes to a 3-point perspective the minute the picture plane is no longer parallel to the ground plane. As you can see in the camera view, the object's vertical lines are starting to get a bit slanted toward a third vanishing point above the horizon as we look up, and toward a third vanishing point below the horizon as we look down. We saw this as well in this example back in the horizon lesson. When we change the eye level on the other hand, the perspective itself changes with it, as we will see here. As we move up as a viewer from the ground level, the eye level starts to move up as well. We know that the horizon line will always be at the eye level, so that will move up with it, changing the parts of the objects we see. When we move above the object, the boxes that were above the horizon line are now below it, allowing us to see the top of them. And as we move down at almost ground level, the boxes are now above our eye level, allowing us to see the bottom of them. So what happens when we combine the two together? Let's do it. Here we are flying above the ground and tilting our head down at the same time. You can see how the horizon line or the eye level is actually moving above our picture plane, while the picture plane is rotating to stay at 90 degrees with the line of sight. If we shift the camera view, we see how the horizon line is moving bit by bit above the picture plane as we look down at the boxes. Now we see the top of the green box, and if we choose a different focal length, we will be able to see the top of all of them. But since we tilted our head down, we move the picture plane away to a certain area of the view, so we only see parts of it. But the horizon line is still above the eye level. If you trace the lines of the boxes, you will see that they meet at a vanishing point above the canvas, or the picture plane. Also notice how the perspective is now distorted to a 3-point perspective, since the line of sight is no longer parallel to the ground plane. This is what we call a bird's eye view. If we do the opposite and move way down to the ground level and look up, now we see the bottom of the objects but not all of them since we tilted our head upward, and we see the distortion as well. This is the worm's eye view, which is the opposite of the bird's eye view. Honestly, I had so much trouble understanding perspective until I tested these scenarios in a 3D environment. It all makes sense now, when you see the whole scene in all angles. Now there are other conditions than changing eye level and eye direction which are a bit extreme, but let's go quickly over them because they all follow the same rules. Also, you might need to use some extreme angles on your drawing, so let's talk about them. First condition is looking left and right in perspective or rotating the camera from a fixed stationary point. In this example, the eye level is the same, the objects are all in the same place, the horizon line is in the same place, but the line of sight or the eye direction is moving left and right. With it, the picture plane is moving as well. Now, what would this affect? I added the vanishing points here in this example because these are the things that will change, not as their position in the scene, but their position in relation to the picture plane. You can see it clearly here in the top view. We have one vanishing point to the left and one to the right, a bit further. As we look to the left, the vanishing point gets closer and closer from the left side all the way to the center of the picture plane. And as we look to the right, we see the other vanishing point moving toward the center of the picture plane. This is basically moving from a 2-point perspective when the vanishing point is almost in the center of the picture plane when we look at this angle. This will also explain the 1-point perspective to you in a way that a 2D drawing will never do. At this angle, the left vanishing point is in the exact center of the picture plane, and you can see how the other vanishing point is parallel to the picture plane. So the lines of the blue box will look 100% horizontal from one side and going back to the one vanishing point in the center for the other. This is what a 1-point perspective basically is, a 2-point perspective where the other vanishing point is parallel to the picture plane. And as we move toward the second vanishing point, it happens again but in the other way. So turning your camera or your head left and right won't change the levels or the horizon line, but it will affect the vanishing point's location and the type of perspective you see on your picture plane. Either 1 or 2-point perspective. Just like the tilting up and down would change it from 2 to 3-point perspective or 1 to 3-point perspective and so on. Now we go to an extreme example. Tilting the picture plane itself left and right. They call this a Dutch angle or a roll to the left or the right. This is used in movies to show uncertainty or an action scene where the stakes are high. The viewer or the camera is in the same place. The eye level is in the same place. The horizon line is in the same place. Even the line of sight is in the same place. The only thing different here is the picture plane itself, and the head of the viewer, of course, or the camera rolling in its place to the left or the right. Take note of where the horizon line is in relation to the picture plane. Instead of being parallel to the picture plane, top and bottom edges, now it's going from one corner to the other. The horizon line is tilting from one side to the other, changing the vertical line's orientation according to the horizon line. You'll see this a lot in concept art pieces where there is an action or a fight scene. It will add some motion and uncertainty to the view, and it's very tricky to do at first, but it does pay off eventually with a very dramatic scene at the end. Here the vanishing points will be on different levels, along with the tilted horizon line, and every vertical line will be rotated, as well with the horizon line. It's still a 2-point perspective here, so don't confuse this with a 3-point perspective where the lines go toward a top vanishing point. Although you could have a tilted 3-point perspective if you look up or down while rolling the view to the left or the right. But this is just adding more and more to the complexity of the scene. I would not recommend this for beginners, to be honest. It needs some serious practice to pull it off, but it is fun to do nonetheless. The final scenario is not really related to the factors of perspective, but the objects in perspective itself. Objects in perspective can rotate in 3 axes, X, Y, and Z. And that will change the vertical lines of the object, the horizontal lines, and all the lines in the object no matter if you are doing 1 or 2 or 3-point perspective. This has to do with the axis vanishing point of the object. So every object has 3 vanishing axes, X, Y, and Z. If you look at this box, it's a 1-point perspective, but automatically it will have 3 different vanishing axes. The x-axis going horizontally from one side to the other, a y-axis going back to the vanishing point that we see on our picture plane, and a z-axis going vertically. To understand this, we need to understand that the actual environment around us is not a 2D plane, it's a 360-degree sphere all around us. As I zoom out, you start to see this box rotating around this axis inside a giant sphere. As we rotate it, you will see the x, y, and z axis rotating on the surface of this sphere, around the viewer. So when you see one-point perspective, you are only seeing a snippet of this 360-degree perspective, printed on a picture plane in front of you. Now this picture plane might catch one vanishing point that you can see ahead of you, but that doesn't mean that this is all there is. The rest of the scene will always be this giant environment all around you. As I rotate this box around the x and y axis, now you see this 2-point perspective between these points. As I move the box in a z axis, now we have a 3-point perspective happening with all 3 axes moving around us. But you may ask, what about the 4-point perspective, the 5-point perspective, and so on? This will have to do with the type of camera lens you are using to capture this 3D environment. Using a fisheye lens will turn this into a 4-point perspective, with the lines between the axis points curving instead of being straight lines, leading to a 4-point perspective. As for the 5-point perspective, is capturing the perspective on a giant sphere. Same with the 6-point perspective, but with a transparent giant sphere, and so on. But all of them are represented with this 3D world. It's just up to the artist to choose how to represent this world on his or her canvas. Now one thing to note is these axes are 90 degrees perpendicular on each other, only because this shape is a box. A box have edges that are 90 degrees perpendicular on each other, and thus the axis will follow. But as we move on to other shapes like this hexahedron, it will have different axes with different angles of 120 degrees, and it will have more than 2 or 3 vanishing points. A road with twists and turns will have multiple vanishing points, not just 2 or 3. It's not changing the type of perspective, it's just adding more vanishing points. You can still have a 2-point perspective but with multiple vanishing points depending on the shape you are drawing. More on this later on. Now let's go from using 3D to explain the picture plane to using 3D and 2D together. I'm trying to tie this up from a 3D environment all the way to drawing lines on a 2D canvas step by step. If we go back to this example, let's try to draw what we see on the picture plane without looking at the camera. Using this method, the box is not on the ground, so let's drop lines from all corners to the ground plane first. From the ground projection corners, we connect it back to the stationary point ground projection. So from the stationary point or the eye of the person all the way to the ground under his feet. This will be the ground projection of the stationary point. Wherever the lines hit the projection edge of the picture plane on the ground level, we draw vertical lines all the way to the picture plane. This will be the edge limit of the box. To see where the box will be, we connect from the stationary point or the start of the cone of vision or the eye of the viewer to all the corners of the box, the top and the bottom ones. Now this might be tricky, but take your time. Wherever these lines cross the vertical lines we just drew, this will be the edges of the box on the picture plane. To double check your work, use the vanishing points we have to connect in between the vertical lines of the box. That's how you know your work is correct as well. And as you can see here, it hits at the same corners we just drew. To check our work even further, we can copy the camera view we had before and paste it on top of the picture plane to see if our work is correct. And there it is, 100% exactly where we drew it. This is the 2D projection of this 3D environment on this picture plane. This is the perspective we draw on our canvas. Now before we go to a 2D drawing, let's try another example first. Here we have two boxes, one on the ground, one above it. We have the picture plane, the horizon line, the projection on the ground, so let's do the same thing we did before. Connect the ground projection of the box to the stationary point on the ground. Since the first box is already on the ground, we can connect the corners right away to the other point. Wherever they hit the projection line of the picture plane, we go vertical all the way to the picture plane. From there, we connect the cone of vision start point or the stationary point to all corners of the box, and wherever they hit the vertical lines, we get our box. The first box looks like in a one-point perspective, so we don't see its side in this view, we only see its depth. Now let's do the other box. Since it's high above the ground, we project it to the ground first, and then back to the ground projection of the stationary point. We draw the verticals next, and then connect in between the box corners and the stationary point. Finally, we draw the box in the cross points between the lines. Let's now check our work by adding the picture plane from the camera itself. Let's move it into the picture plane perspective, and let's move it behind the lines. And there you go, our work is 100% correct. This is how we draw the picture plane projection using the 3D environment. Let's take it another step forward toward the 2D drawing. What if we only have the top projection and a 3D image of the environment? How can we turn this top projection into a 3D representation in perspective? So here we have the picture plane, the object, and the reference image. We can draw the ground plane and the horizon line to transform this top view into a perspective drawing. To find this vanishing point for this object, we simply draw lines that are parallel to the lines of the box from the picture plane all the way to the stationary point shown below in red. So these are the two lines from each side of the box. Let's move it now to the stationary point. Whenever these lines cross with the picture plane, we draw a vertical line all the way to the horizon line up there. That's where the vanishing points will be. Now we can start drawing the box. Let's find a reference point where we can start from. The front edge of the box is at the picture plane edge. Like we saw before, we can shoot a line from the bottom of the edge of the box to the stationary point, and wherever that line hit the ground projection of the picture plane, we can draw a vertical line all the way up to draw the box on. So we do the same here. We draw the vertical line all the way up, and this will be the front edge location. Now since this is a top view, we can't shoot a line from the eye of the viewer to the corners, but we can guesstimate it from the reference image, seeing that the box is starting from the ground all the way above the horizon line. Now there are different calculations for this, but this is already too deep into perspective for beginners, so I'm not just going to go there just yet. So let's mark a point above the horizon line for the edge of the box. The other limit, of course, would be the ground point. Now we have the edge of the box. We simply connect it to both vanishing points to get the side edges of the box. So where do these edges end? We can easily get that from the box top view by connecting both corners back to the viewers as we did before. Wherever these lines intersect with the picture plane, we shoot vertical lines upward, and that will be the limits of the box on both sides. Now we have the box drawn using the picture plane. To check our work, let's draw this on the 3D reference photo. We do what we saw before, connect the bottom edges to the ground projection of the stationary point, shoot it up vertically, and then intersect it with the lines from the corner of the box to the stationary point. And this is the same drawing. The only distortion we see here is due to the picture plane being in perspective instead of being in the front view like we drew it here on the left. So now we saw the connection between the 3D environment and the picture plane. Let's see it now in 2D without any 3D reference. So the goal here is to get the default perspective drawn without too much distortion. How we can get the perfect perspective? The common sense would be starting with the stationary point, but instead we will start with the horizon line. The stationary point, as you will see, will be affected by the cone of vision angle, and that can be at any degrees, as we saw before. So if you want to stick with the 60 degrees cone of vision or the 35mm, you can simply start with the stationary point and draw the cone of vision afterward. But if you are not sure yet, you can start with the horizon line first. Next, we draw the circle that represents the end part of the cone of vision. Anything inside this circle will have much less distortion than anything outside of it. Next, we draw the picture plane. Now the picture plane can be at any size as we saw before. It can be outside of the cone of vision or at any position. But for the default perspective, let's put it in the middle of the cone of vision, so it can be covered by the cone of vision, thus removing any distortion all around the picture plane. Here we see the horizon line is in the dead center of the picture plane. Again, you can place it up, down, or even outside of the picture plane. But let's keep it simple and draw it in the center. To draw the stationary point, let's get the center of the picture plane using diagonals. From the center of the picture plane, I draw a line all the way down toward the stationary point, since this is the cone of vision. And at the end of the cone of vision would be the viewer. But I don't know where to place the viewer here. So to get the stationary point, I marked the 2 points where the cone of vision interact with the eye level or the horizon line. Then I draw the cone of vision as a 60-degree triangle, and whenever that triangle intersects with the line of sight we drew, that will be our stationary point. So I draw a line and rotate it 30 degrees from the line of sight in the center for the right side, and another one for the left side. This will make our 60 degrees cone of vision. Here is our stationary point, and this is our 35mm focal length. Now if you are confused why this is drawn in the bottom of the drawing, simply we are flattening the perspective down. In 3D we have the stationary point behind the picture plane, but since we are doing this in 2D, we can't draw it on top of it. So we have to project it down below or to the side in order to draw it in a 2D environment. So the last point is where to draw the vanishing points. Again, this can vary with what objects you want to draw, but let's keep it simple and say we have a box. So boxes have 90 degrees angled as we said. So let's draw a line, rotate it 45 degrees from the center line, and connect it to the stationary point. Let's do another one to the other side. Now we have 90 degrees angle between the two lines. Wherever these lines intersect with the horizon line, that's your vanishing points. Very simple. Now anything I draw inside of the cone of vision will be without distortion. So let's draw a box using all the elements and the vanishing points. And there you go, a very good looking box. Let's do another one down there. Again, very little distortion. Once I move away from the cone of vision and the center of focus, we start to see distortion on our box. It's still good, but it's a bit distorted. So if you want your drawing to look very technical, very straight, and very formal, you will stick to the picture plane in the middle. If you want more artistic and more dynamic perspective, you will start changing these default factors to fit your need. And what if you have other boxes that are using different vanishing points? Very simple. Just rotate the angle of the vanishing point around, keeping the same 90 degrees in between. And wherever these lines intersect with the horizon line, that will be your new vanishing points. Just make sure you draw them in different colors, or you're gonna confuse some of them and draw them from two different vanishing point set. So you don't always have to have a 45 degrees on both sides. You can go 30 to 60 degrees, 10 and 80, 50 and 40, whatever the angles that end up in a 90 degrees vanishing point, especially if you are drawing a box-shaped object. Because we saw it in the X and Y axis, they are perpendicular on each other, especially if you are drawing a box. But keep in mind other shapes exist, as we saw with the hexagon. So what happens if we use different focal length? For example, a 100mm or a 24-degree cone of vision. Well, let's find out. Here I start with the picture plane, because why not? Then I add the horizon line. Now let's add the cone of vision. Here's the line of sight. So where would the stationary point be for this focal length? From the intersection points of the cone of vision and the horizon line, I draw a line and rotate it 12 degrees from each side, away from the center, to get our 24 degrees cone of vision. As we said before, the smaller the cone of vision, the bigger the focal length. And you can see it right here. Before we had a shorter stationary point distance, i.e. a shorter focal length, with a 60-degree cone of vision and 35mm focal length. At 100mm focal length, you see how far the stationary point is from the picture plane. So if you want to draw the same vanishing points at 90 degrees here, look how far it is from the horizon line, which means the vanishing points will be so far away from each other and away from the picture plane. We saw before how further away the vanishing points are from the canvas, the flatter the objects will be. So if you draw a box now using these vanishing points, even though the box is under the horizon line a little bit, it still looks flat. Even when we draw it above the horizon line, we see very little of the bottom side, because the vanishing points are so far away, it's almost a flat box. If we put the 35mm example here, you can see how close the vanishing points are in comparison. You can see this also in pictures taken with higher focal length lenses. Not just here in landscape images where you see the zoom effect, but also in the same distance, as we see here in these portraits. In the shorter focal length lenses, there is more roundness showing here in the face, like it has sides. But as the focal length gets higher, the whole face looks like it's on a flat disc, flattening the sides of the face and showing it in the front view, instead of the side view. For a simpler example, here is a couple of boxes and a cylinder at a normal focal length around 35mm. As we go lower to 20, 10, even 5, you can see how sharp the angles will get almost to 1 point perspective in a very distorted way. You start to only see one side of the box. That's because the vanishing points are getting closer and closer, almost merging into one for the whole scene, which is why they are starting to look weird. As we increase the focal length up to 100, 200 or 500mm, you can see the boxes are getting flat, so much so you will see both sides almost as one, with a line in between. That's because the vanishing points are getting further and further away from each other, almost to parallel lines on each side of the canvas, which flatten the boxes. So if you can go back to the 2D drawing, you can now understand how and why things look distorted, flat, or just perfect, depending on all these factors of perspective. Let's do one more example. Going all the way to 40mm or 114 degrees cone of vision. This is where things start to get distorted in the other way, pushing the stationary point further ahead a bit closer, and with it the vanishing points. So as before, we draw the horizon line, the cone of vision, and the line of sight. From the intersection point of the cone of vision and the horizon line, we draw the cone of vision back toward the stationary point. Now 114 degrees will be 57 degrees on each side. So let's draw the angle on both sides. Look how close the stationary point is to the picture plane. So now if I add the 19 degrees vanishing points on each side from the stationary point, the vanishing points hit the horizon line inside of the picture plane, resulting in a distorted scene. So let's draw a box inside and see how it looks. Don't get me wrong, it's still a good scene. Most of the example we did had the vanishing points inside of the canvas, but it is distorted nonetheless, in comparison of course to the 35mm and 60 degrees cone of vision. If we put all three together, you can see the stationary point position in all of them and how that affects the vanishing points and the distortion in the scene in each setting. That's why Scott Robertson always suggests to use the 60 degrees cone of vision for all his drawings, to get the best of both worlds. Less distorted than the short focal length example and not as flat as the long focal length one. Alright, let's go over all the examples we saw in 3D, but now let's do them in 2D along with other stuff like multiple vanishing points. So we saw how the stationary point on the viewer moving back and forth affecting the distance from the object and thus the size of the object in your scene. It's not zooming in and out or changing the focal length. You are literally moving forward toward the object or away from it. It's best demonstrated by drawing the perspective on the picture plane in the scene. So we already drew this in the normal mid-range. Let's draw it again when we move away from the object. We start the same way, projecting the box on the ground and then back to the ground projections of the stationary point. Wherever it interacts with the picture plane projection on the ground, we draw vertical lines all the way to the picture plane. Then we simply connect between the viewer point and the corners of the box. On the intersection points with the vertical lines, we draw the projection of the box on the picture plane. And that's it. This is the perspective view from that distance away from the box. Let's now move forward with both the viewer and the picture plane all the way next to the box and do the same process. Here is the box touching the picture plane, so the front corner of the box will be directly on the ground projection of the picture plane. We project the corners to the stationary point and vertically toward the picture plane. We connect the corners of the stationary point and draw the box in between the intersection points. Now half of the box is below the picture plane, meaning that we only see the top part of the box in our perspective. So think of this if you are the viewer. As we move back, we see the box getting smaller and smaller. And as we move forward, the box starts to get bigger and bigger until we almost on top of it, and we only see part of it in our picture plane view. So this is the effect of moving the viewer with the picture plane together while keeping the same cone of vision angle, picture plane size, and the focal length distance. The only thing changing here is our position as a viewer. Alright, let's see how much moving the eye level up and down would change the perspective in 2D. Here we have the default view with the viewer on the ground as we saw it in 3D. Now as we move up, the eye level, the horizon line, the picture plane, and the cone of vision, even the vanishing points, all move up with us. And notice how as we move up, the horizon line is moving above the boxes, ending up with the smaller one completely outside of the picture plane, with the second and third boxes under the horizon line. So to draw this new perspective now, I keep the same box size by drawing the middle edge and then connect it to the new position of the vanishing points on the horizon line. When I do this, you can notice how we see the top of the box now that we didn't see before. I do the same for the rest of the boxes. All the boxes now are under the horizon line, so we see the top face of each one of them. Let's clean up the drawing now and draw the final boxes. And this is the old versus the new box's position, once we moved up and moved the eye level along with us. As we compare it to the old position, we see now all three boxes that were in different levels are now all under the horizon line. Let's do this again, but now lowering the horizon line and the eye level below the boxes, as if we are sinking in the ground. Now the vanishing points and the horizon line is under the boxes, so we can now see the bottom face of all of them. I draw the new boxes and connect them to the new vanishing points and clean it up afterwards. And here are all the boxes, all above the horizon line, where we can see the bottom of them. You can also start to see how the boxes get a bit distorted as we move away above or below the cone of vision. And these are the three different positions of the stationary point: on the ground, above it, and below it, both in 3D and 2D. Alright, next up, tilting the head up and down while on the same ground level. We saw how objects look like when we move up and down physically. Let's see now when the eye level is the same but the eye direction moves up and down with the tilt of the head. So as we saw in the 3D example, the picture plane will move up when we tilt our head upward to stay perpendicular on the line of sight. So the picture plane will no longer be parallel to the ground plane. It will tilt a bit as we move our sight upward. So let us replicate it here in 2D, but for simplicity's sake, I will keep it as it is here, to see the relation between the horizon line and the picture plane as we look up. When we moved the horizon line up in the previous example, we started seeing the top side of the boxes. But here we are not moving the horizon line, just the picture plane. So the box's position to the horizon line will stay the same, but the horizon line will be lower in our view as we look up. So instead of being in the middle as the first example, now it's in the bottom. When the picture plane is no longer parallel to the ground plane, we will start to have a distortion in the vertical axis, as we saw in the previous street example. So we will end up turning this 2-point perspective into a 3-point perspective, ending up with a third point above the horizon line when we look up and below the horizon line when we look down. Now let's pause for a second. You might be asking, how would I know where to place the third vanishing point exactly in relation to the tilt, the picture plane, and the horizon line? Well, there is a way to find out exactly where to place the third vanishing point, but it is a bit too complicated method for a beginner series. It is more of an advanced process that involves some of the technique we did for the perfect cube, if you remember. So for this section, I would just put the third vanishing point at a random position that won't distort the scene too much. The higher it is, the better. But if you want precise location and the process to get it, I will refer you to this Dan Beardshaw video about the subject. The link will be in the top right and in the description box. If you don't know who Dan is, he is the perspective guy on YouTube, and you will find really amazing videos on his channel about everything concerning perspective drawing, both basic and advanced stuff. I could not recommend him enough. But for now, let's just place the third point above the horizon line as high as possible away from the picture plane. From this point, I connect a line to the boxes we have already converted into a 3-point perspective box. Now you can connect the box from the top or the bottom, but I prefer to connect it from the center of the edge in the middle, to keep the size of the box approximately the same as the original box. Again, this is not 100% accurate, but we are more looking at the scene as a whole instead of drawing the exact boxes here. From the center edge, I draw the new edge toward the third vanishing point and connect it to both left and right vanishing point to get our box. Then I use the limit of the old box to get the other two faces. I do the same for the other box and draw it in a 3-point perspective as well. Let's clean up the lines and see what we got. So these are the old boxes, and these are the same boxes as we look up. You can see that we only see the top part of the small box and 3/4 of the right box after we looked up. Also, we can see the distortion of the perspective converted from 2 to 3-point perspective due to the tilt of the angle. Now the tilt seems a bit too much here, but the more you push the third point perspective upward, the less distorted it will be. The closer it is to the picture plane, the more distorted it will get. Now let's see the other side of this process. Looking down, same thing. But now as we look down, the picture plane will go down and the horizon line will go up in relation to the picture plane. So now the third vanishing point will be below the horizon line since we are looking down. So let's draw the new boxes with the new tilt and see what we get. Let's clean up the lines a bit. And here are the new boxes. We only see half of the right box and all of the left one, but with a distortion toward the third vanishing point. If you check the position of the horizon line in relation to the boxes, you will see that it's still the same in all three scenes. going through the center of the tall box and a little bit above the short one. As you can see, in all three scenes that didn't change, because the eye level is still the same, while the eye directions moved up and down. When you combine this scene in 2D and see it in 3D, it will all make more sense now. Let's take it up a notch and merge the two processes together, moving upward and looking down at the same time, or moving down and looking up at the same time. Or to put it in another way, let's see how bird's eye view and the worm's view look like in 2D. We saw how they looked like in 3D, so let's draw them in 2D now. So let's see what happens when we move above the ground and look down as in the bird's eye view. Now when you do that, as we saw in the 3D environment, the picture plane stays perpendicular to the line of sight. So as we look down, it should look tilted in 2D as well, but your canvas won't look like it in 2D. So we will keep it as it is, and this distortion will be conveyed through the transition from 2-point perspective into 3-point perspective. So we notice how the horizon line is not only above the boxes, but all the way outside the picture plane, since we are moving up and looking down at the same time. So we saw with tilting we need to draw the third vanishing point. As we said, you can find its exact location through a long method, or just guesstimating it for now, which what we will do here. Now as we are looking down, the third point will be below the picture plane. So let's add that point there away from the picture plane. Now we connect the box edges to that point and redraw the limits from the initial boxes. Now we connect back to the two vanishing points on the horizon line and close the box backside. We do the same for the other boxes. Let's clean up the lines and draw the final boxes now. And here are the three boxes in bird's eye view. We see the top of all of them since we are hovering above them. And we also see the tilt as well toward the third vanishing point. It is a very dynamic view that used a lot in comic books, especially with flying superheroes. But also it shows the aerial view of the scene from the top. So it's a very useful view to use. Let's now do the opposite and do the worm's eye view by moving below the horizon line and tilting the view upward. Same process, but this time the horizon line will be below the picture plane and the third vanishing point will be above the picture plane since we are looking up. Let's add the third vanishing point and connect it back to the boxes. Let's clean up the lines. and here are the boxes. Now, of course, if the boxes were on the ground, we wouldn't see the bottom, but since they are above the ground, we see the bottom of all of them, and the distortion toward the third vanishing point above. And here are the different views: the human eye view, the bird's eye view, and the worm's eye view. Each has its own pros and cons, and you can use whatever the best is for your scene. Alright, now let's go over some rare situations we saw in the 3D before. Tilting the view angle while stationary. Now we are rotating the picture plane clockwise and anti-clockwise as we saw in the 3D example before. So let's see how this will look in 2D. Let's copy the same scene again. And now instead of rotating the canvas, we will do as we did with the previous example and keep it stationary and rotate the scene instead. See, the canvas is your painting. You won't be saving a rotated file. It will just look weird. So instead, you will keep it as a rectangle or a square and rotate the scene inside it instead. So here I rotated the line of sight along with the horizon line this time. The previous example, we kept the horizon line because we only looked left and right. But since we are tilting our head or the camera, the horizon line will tilt as well. Here is the 3D view again just to see it in action. In 3D, the picture plane is rotating while the scene is stationary. But if you look at the view, we see the scene itself rotating. If you are trying to rotate your head, this won't happen. The scene won't rotate. Vertical lines will stay vertical as you rotate your head. This can be fixed in cameras to keep the vertical line vertical. But what if you don't want this to be fixed and you want a dynamic scene with rotated vertical lines? Well, we rotate the whole scene and keep our canvas stationary. And this is what we get. Now inside your painting, all the vertical lines are tilted along with the line of sight. The horizon line and the vanishing points are tilted with it, while the picture plane is in the same position. So it's basically choosing to keep your painting normal and doing the effect to the scene instead. That's what perspective basically is. It's the illusion of 3D drawn on a 2D canvas. And that's what we are trying to do here. So now anything you want to draw in your new perspective should follow the new vanishing points and the new vertical line of the new line of sight. You can rotate the scene again anti-clockwise and get the same result. These types of perspective are dynamic, interesting to look at, and very unstable as well. You would use them mostly for action shots to show danger or uncertainty. They look really cool. There is one last condition of rotation we didn't talk about yet, which is rotating the object in the scene itself, not the picture plane or the horizon line, but the objects in it. We talked before about multiple vanishing points in a scene, and now we can have different vanishing points for rotated objects or for the objects that have more edges than a simple box. Let's look at this in a 360 degrees and see how we can have multiple two vanishing points in one scene and why we can't have the same for the 1-point perspective. Here is a normal 2-point perspective scene. Let's draw a box on it using these two vanishing points. Now let's rotate the vanishing points from the center of the stationary point a little bit clockwise. Same 90 degrees since we are drawing a box, and now we got two new vanishing points. And as we keep moving the axis of the vanishing points, we get more and more points in the scene. We might get one vanishing point in the scene or even two, depending on the distortion angle. So you can have as many two vanishing points combination in the same scene depending on your objects, like we saw with rotating boxes. Now at some point you will reach this angle, one vanishing point perpendicular on the picture plane and one parallel to it, or what we call a 1-point perspective. Let's draw a box using these vanishing points. If I'm to add another vanishing point in the scene and use it as another 1-point perspective and draw another box, we will have a problem. If I connect this new point to the stationary point in a perpendicular line, we won't hit the same stationary point. What this means, we have two viewers to the same scene, which is impossible. Two viewers mean two scenes, not one. So let's force it and connect it to the stationary point. Now we have one vanishing point at an angle and the other is parallel to the picture plane. So we no longer have a 90 degrees angle between the vanishing points. So if you want to use one vanishing point to draw two different boxes in the same rotation, it will not work out. If you say, well, what if I want to rotate a box in a 1-point perspective? Then you will simply have a 2-point perspective right away, because the vanishing point is no longer parallel to the picture plane. So yes, it is possible to have 1-point perspective and 2-point perspective happening at the same time in the same scene, but not two different 1-point perspectives in the same scene, especially if you are drawing the same box in two places using two different locations for the vanishing point. I hope it makes sense. Just keep this in mind. If you want multiple vanishing points in your scene, it can't be two different locations of the same one vanishing point. But you can have one vanishing point in different locations in regard to the picture plane, meaning it can be somewhere else other than the center. And this happens by keeping everything as it is and moving the picture plane instead. This is not rotating the picture plane as we saw before, it's just cropping the image in a way that the vanishing point is no longer in the center, like we see in these different examples. I think the best way to understand the vanishing point is to know what it is in a 3D environment. They are not just 2 points on the horizon line, they are axes in 3 different directions rotating on 3 different ellipses around the viewer. To understand it, let's go back to a 3D example. Here is our box, with 3 different axes from each corner. Red x-axis, green y-axis, and a blue z-axis. As they extend toward the horizon line, these axes end up meeting at the vanishing point. So when we rotate the box, we see how the axes are rotating from 2-point perspective left and right to 1-point perspective in the middle, while the third z-axis is the vertical one above us as we rotate this in a 3-dimensional scene. This is what you see when you draw in perspective. But let's zoom out a little bit to see the reality behind the scene. And there it is. This is the world you are trying to symbolize in perspective lines. It is a full-on 360-degree environment all around us. Now the horizon line is an ellipse all around us, where the x and y axes rotate on it. But at the same time, the x and y axes also rotate vertically, connecting with the vertical vanishing point, crafting this spherical world around us. As we rotate the object in a 1 or 2-point perspective, both axes or vanishing points stay on the horizon line in front of us. Or to put it another way, when we rotate in the z-axis, the z vanishing point is stationary and the x and y axis rotate on the z-plane. Now look what happened when we rotate on the x-axis. Now the x-axis becomes stationary and the y and z-axis rotate on the x-plane instead. Same thing happens when we rotate on the y-axis. Now that we saw the larger picture, let's go back to our view. Here how it looks like when we rotate on the z-axis again. The third vanishing point or the z-axis is stationary, so this will stay as either 1-point or 2-point perspective, as the x and y-axis or the vanishing points rotate on the z-plane or the ground plane in this image. As we rotate the box on the y-axis, the green one, now the x and z-axis rotate on the plane perpendicular to the y-axis or the y-plane. If we rotate it again on the x-axis, we see the y and z vanishing point rotating on the x-axis plane. Now this example will explain why we draw the vertical line from our vanishing points to rotate objects as we saw in the rotation lesson. And this is a reminder of that lesson. We can see how we drew the vertical line on top of the vanishing points when we rotated boxes. And with the 3D example now we know why, because we are drawing the rotating axis that these vanishing points rotate on. Let's go back to a 2D drawing. Here's the horizon line, the 2 vanishing points, and the picture plane. Let's draw a quick box. These are the 3 vanishing points for this box, 2 on the horizon line and 1 vertical. Or as we saw in the 3D example, they are all 3-dimensional axes in the 360-degree environment. Let's say we want to rotate this box. We can use the rotation ellipse to rotate 2 edges and then draw the rest from there. The rotation isn't my goal here. It's seeing how the rotation affects the vanishing points. We're gonna rotate around the top edge in the middle. We did a lot of rotation exercise in lesson 23 if you want to check it out. But for now, let's connect the lines of the box to see where it will lead us. Since we are rotating on the x-axis or on the plane of the vanishing points on the left, we will draw the vertical line from the other vanishing point to rotate the other two axes on. Now let's connect the edges for the rotated box toward the vertical line and see where they will meet. And as you can see, the y and z vanishing points are now on this vertical line, where the x vanishing point is still in its place since it's the axis we are rotating around. If we rotate it again on a different location around the ellipse, we see how the vanishing points keep moving on that vertical axis, which is basically the x-axis plane that we are rotating around. Let's take this exact example back to the 3D just to nail the idea down. And here is the same box connecting to the 3 axis with the vertical line on the y-z axis. As we rotate the box like we did in 2D, you can see that the y and z vanishing points are rotating on the plane over and over where the x vanishing point is stationary. The vertical line is not actually a line, it's a 360-degree line or an ellipse, but we see it as a vertical line since we are drawing it in a 2D environment. Hopefully this made rotating objects in perspective more understandable than just seeing it in 2D. But let's look at some other examples of rotation and multiple vanishing points. Here we see different objects in perspective. Every one of them will have its own vanishing points or 3 unique axes. The green big box will have 2 vanishing points in the horizon and 1 vertical vanishing point. Same for the blue one, but on different location. As for the octahedron, it will have multiple vanishing points that goes with each phase. Now for the slanted green box, it will have, like we saw earlier, an X vanishing point on the horizon line that is static, and 2 other dynamic axes rotating as the box rotates toward the blue box on the X plane. So these 2 axes will go all the way toward the same vertical line upon the second vanishing point if the box was not rotating. So multiple vanishing points will be the norm once you start drawing complex scenes. And as you understand the 3D environment around your scene, you will be able to understand how to compose a correct environment not by guessing, but by understanding how the scene would work in the real life. That's why concept artists end up creating their basic scene in a 3D software before moving it to Photoshop to add the details. Simply cutting all the calculation we did here by letting the 3D software do it for them. But now you understand the process in case you want to draw it all on 2D yourself. So it is important to understand the process, because if you just go to 3D software directly without understanding it in 2D, you might end up with a wrong perspective yet again. Here's another example I found online. Simple chest of drawers, with each and every one pointing and rotating in a different direction. Ended up with an interesting shapes and composition using multiple vanishing points rotating on different planes. When I started this mini-series, I made sure to include 3D examples on every step of the way. There is a reason for that. You will need to understand forms, not shapes. Drawing shapes or outlines will not convey the real information behind the object. It will not explain the real size of this truck, the real perspective, the real dimensions, if you only draw it as an outline. But once you understand the forms in full 3D from all sides, in all foreshortened situations, from all angles, from all directions, from all distortions, from any distance, in any quantities, in any conversions, in any size, in any perspective angle, in any perspective type, in any color, in any texture, and in any lighting condition or composition, once you understand the form itself, you can control it, rotate it, move it, scale it, and reshape it and use it in any location you want in your drawing and in any art piece you want to do. When you understand form, you can finally draw it from your imagination in any way you want, which is basically the ultimate goal for an artist to do. I hope this video answered some of your questions about perspective by showing you the full scene in front of your picture plane and all around it in 3D, 2D, and everything in between. You might have even more questions after watching this, but to be honest, anything more than this will have to be in the second chapter of this mini-series, the intermediate part of this course. For now, I think we have enough information as an introduction to perspective to get you started on your own journey. I encourage you to understand any scene you want to draw by using a 3D software. Try to build the mock-up scene using simple basic shapes just to understand the scene you want to draw. You can use simple free software like SketchUp or Blender to fashion a quick composition and then seeing the scene from all around. It will make your understanding of perspective much smoother than doing it 100% in a 2D drawing. For now, we are really done with the first part of this course, the introduction part. All that's left now is doing some exercises of everything we learned so far. I don't know if I will do it in 6 videos or merge them into 3, but I know one video for all exercises will just be too long. So in the next video, we will start doing few exercises on the first few lessons and see how it goes. As for now, it's time to end this long lesson. I'm sorry it took a while to do it, but I hope you find it useful and easy to watch. And most importantly, I hope it answered some of your questions on perspective. As always, if you like this lesson, feel free to leave a like. If you have any questions, leave it down in the comment section, and I will do my best to answer them as soon as possible. To stay notified for future lessons, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you in the next video.